Hello, and welcome to Brian's Computer Retreat. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the PowerBook Duo 280C and trying to get it ready for a future video. First off, we have to remove the PowerBook's battery. I've rebuilt mine, and it's a little bit more snug than it should be, so it takes a bit of extra work to get it out. With the battery removed, we can flip the PowerBook over and remove the 4 Torx screws that hold it together. For normal service, you'd only have to remove the top 3, after which you can remove the keyboard, which gives you access to most of the major components of the system. With the screws removed, you can flip the PowerBook back over and start to remove the keyboard. Simply pick up at the front end of the keyboard and lift away from the machine, being careful not to stress the connectors that go to the logic board. Unplug the connectors and then remove the keyboard. Next, we want to remove the end clutch covers. To do this, insert a spudger at the edge of the clutch cover and gently pry towards the end of the machine. As you can see in my video, this was very difficult and stressful considering how fragile the plastics have become. Just remember to use constant but gentle force, and they should eventually slide off without any major issues. With the clutch covers removed, we can now remove the palm rest section. Gently disengage the tabs at the battery compartment and on the right-hand side of the battery compartment, where the hard drive is. Then lift the palm rest section away from the bottom case. Be sure to keep track of the pieces of rubber on either side of the computer. Next, we have to remove the screws holding the hard drive in place. In my PowerBook, I've replaced my hard drive with a SCSI to SD adapter. We need to remove the SCSI to SD adapter so that the cables are not in the way when we remove the chassis stiffener later in the disassembly. Now I'm going to remove the screws holding the trackball in place. When I previously disassembled this machine, I routed the trackball cable under the chassis stiffener, so we won't be able to remove it yet. But once I'm done removing the screws from the trackball, I will remove the remaining cables attached to the logic board, as we will need to remove all of the remaining devices in order to fully disassemble the PowerBook. While the service source manual for the PowerBook says that you need to remove the center clutch cover, I've found that it was much easier to remove as part of the display assembly. So we'll remove the cable going to the LCD, holding the clutch mechanism in place. We can then lift the display out of the bottom casing. You will need to use a spudger to disengage the center clutch cover from the bottom plastics, but I find this much easier when the display is no longer secured to the chassis stiffener. Next, we'll remove the Torx screws that secure the chassis stiffener to the plastic case of the PowerBook. With the screws removed, the chassis stiffener lifts off easily from the PowerBook. With the chassis stiffener removed, there are only a couple more screws holding the logic board to the bottom case of the PowerBook. To do motherboard repairs, I recommend removing the modem and RAM expansion cards if installed. With the motherboard removed from the case for the first time in probably a decade, I'm giving it an inspection to see how bad the corrosion caused by the leaky capacitors may be. Next, I used a set of tweezers to gently inspect the capacitors on the motherboard. I was afraid, because of the strong smell of fish on the motherboard, that the damage may have already been pretty advanced. Now for the potentially controversial part of the recapping. My method of recapping is a little bit different from what I see online, but I find that it has the highest success rate. At least I've never lifted a pad. So what I do is I take a very sharp set of diagonal cutters and cut the capacitor as close to the base as possible. If you cut this properly, it will sever the leads going down to the motherboard, leaving you just the base and a small amount of capacitor to remove. You can gently pull this off of what remains of the leads, giving you a very small amount of metal to desolder from the pads. I usually do this in stages. First, I cut all of the capacitors off. Then I go back and remove all of the bases that are left. Then I wipe the board down with vinegar to neutralize any electrolyte left on the board, and rinse with alcohol to get any vinegar or electrolyte off of the board completely. Finally, I come back with the soldering iron and remove all of the remaining pads, and start to get some fresh tinning on the pads themselves. Finally, with the old capacitors removed and the board cleaned, it's time to install the new ones. I typically go with tantalum surface mount capacitors, as they are usually smaller than their electrolytic counterparts, which makes them a bit easier to install. They also have no fluid electrolyte in them, so they don't leak when they go bad. There are some other electronic issues with tantalums compared to electrolytics, so I urge you to research this on your own and make your own decision for your machines. My technique for installing surface mount components with a pencil-type soldering iron is to solder one end of the component to one pad, which I've already tinned in the previous step. I then move to the other side of the pad and get it soldered down. You need to be careful not to use too much solder, otherwise the surface mount component may not sit flush to the board. Another feature of tantalum capacitors compared to their electrolytic counterparts is that their soldering points typically go around the edge of the capacitor, making it a little bit easier to install. The capacitors on this motherboard are in a very tight cluster of the motherboard, so be very careful when installing them, as there's no really good way of doing them. Feel free to follow the order I did them in. It worked out for me, but just take your time when you get to this part, because it is a very tight quarters and you're really going to need some patience to get everything down correctly. Before reassembling the PowerBook, make sure that nothing is shorting out and that everything is soldered down neatly. Remember that the chassis stiffener does come over this part of the board, so don't get too close to the edges, otherwise you may cause a short. After a few more rinsing and repeating steps of resoldering capacitors, you should finally have a recapped PowerBook motherboard. At this point, go over your work and make sure that you did a good job and that everything is soldered down securely. Clean any excess flux off of your board, and hopefully you're ready to reinstall. I'm not going to bore you with the reassembly instructions, as it's just the disassembly but in reverse. As you can see on screen, we've successfully recapped my PowerBook. Hopefully it'll run for years to come and serve as a trusty PowerBook to keep by my side. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, let YouTube know with the buttons down below. And make sure you get subscribed, because I plan on bringing you a video on the PowerBook Duo and its influence on other computers in the near future. See y'all next time.